when Werner von Braun was just starting out in his career, and Hermann Oberth was working on an extremely interesting project which surprisingly would become as relevant to the Apollo program as would the V2.
In the late 1920s, Hermann Oberth was invited to work on the German production Frau im Mond, Woman in the Moon. It was a Fritz Lang film, with a script credited to Lang's wife, Theo von Harbou. Frau im Mond was a silent movie with its plot based on manned flight to the moon. Oberth was responsible to Fritz Lang for the rocket design and flight details. It would appear that NASA has followed the principal elements of this virtual blueprint ever since. This design was for a multi-step rocket. As each stage runs out of fuel, it drops off into space and the next stage takes over, thrusting the craft further onwards. Oberth's design for the rocket comprised 3 steps. Apollo's launcher, the Saturn V, was a 3-stage rocket. It was constructed in a vertical position in a huge assembly shed. This is the house that Jack built over at the future Cape Kennedy. It's called the Vehicle Assembly Building and is very similar to that first German rocket shed. Inside, the Saturn V rocket was assembled vertically. Lang's rocket was driven out of the shed in a vertical position on a tractor-like transport to the launch location, just as NASA does today using its crawler vehicle. The Soviets, however, preferred to construct their rockets horizontally and then deliver them horizontally to the launch pad, as the Russians still do today. No doubt they recognized that moving a high center of gravity rocket vertically was contrary to common sense. And contrary to some received opinion in the West, the Soviets have in fact always been the world's leaders in rocket development. With 21 firsts in space exploration, they had no need to present the world with rampant virility symbols for their journeys into space. As for NASA's Apollo launcher, the Saturn V, that rocket may not have been as great as it looked. To emphasize the moment before liftoff, Fritz Lang created the 10-9-8 countdown. It was one of the movie's most dramatic features. Lang had intended this countdown procedure merely to increase the dramatic tension at the launch. Lang said that NASA had incorporated another of his damn touches into its space dramas. Lang's actors were strapped to their couches, just as NASA did with Apollo. When the rocket motor had burned for a specified duration, we see first and second stage separation, as was the case with the Saturn V. In order to prevent the occupants from floating around the cabin in microgravity, they used a very practical solution of foot grips. Later, NASA was to stick everything to the walls with Velcro tape. And this attractive and exotic demonstration of the way that water globules will float in microgravity has also become an industry standard. Then the most memorable scene of all, the moon in the foreground and the distant Earth. A scene first visualized in the 1920s. And the lunar landscape as designed by Lang's artists, with the camera set up ready. This look, with its pointed rather than smooth mountains, was copied exactly by NASA's space artists on the decals that depicted the individual Apollo lunar modules. As you can see, the Frau im Mond set matches the LEM 7 decal very closely. Remembering that LEM 7 was allocated to Apollo 13's Dark Moon trip, Is it not significant that this decal is the only one of the Apollo LEM series which depicts a LEM actually sitting on a fake lunar surface?
So all of these NASA procedures had actually been foreseen by a movie director and his colleague in 1927, which is not altogether surprising when that movie director turns out to be the most influential filmmaker of his time and colleague of the most eminent rocket engineer of the 1920s. And since all of these individuals later turned up in America, Nazi scientists von Braun, Dornberger and Obert, who were employed by the American government, while Lang pursued his career in Hollywood, should we then be surprised that the same methodology appears to have re-emerged?
10, 9, ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4...